The sharp crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Helena, Montana territory, but Natalie Armstrong barely flinched from where she sat beneath the sprawling cottonwood tree, her eyes fixed on the worn pages of her book. It was June of 1881, and violence had become as common as the afternoon heat that shimmered off the packed dirt roads. She had learned to distinguish between the sounds that mattered and those that did not, and this particular shot had the hollow ring of celebration rather than danger. Still, her fingers tightened slightly on the leather-bound volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, a treasure she had carried all the way from Boston 3 years ago when her father had dragged the family west in search of fortune that never materialized. The shade of the cottonwood offered the only respite from the relentless sun, and Natalie had claimed this spot as her sanctuary every afternoon for the past 2 weeks, ever since she had returned from burying her father in the hard Montana soil. At 22 years old, she found herself alone in a territory that had little patience for educated women who preferred books to the brutal practicality of frontier survival. Her mother had died of fever the previous winter, leaving Natalie with nothing but a small cabin on the edge of town, a few chickens, and a trunk full of books that most folks in Helena considered more kindling than treasure. She heard the footsteps before she saw him, the distinctive jingle of spurs that marked every cowboy in the territory. Natalie did not look up, hoping whoever it was would pass by without comment. Men in Helena generally fell into 2 categories: those who thought a woman reading was an amusing curiosity, and those who found it threatening. Neither type particularly interested her. "That is Sonnet 116, if I am not mistaken," a voice said, low and thoughtful, with an accent that spoke of education rather than the rough drawl she had grown accustomed to hearing. Natalie's head snapped up, surprise overriding her usual caution. The man standing a few feet away was tall and lean, with the sun-weathered face of someone who spent his days outdoors, but his eyes held an intelligence that seemed at odds with the dusty chaps and worn leather vest that marked him as a working cowboy. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and a strong jaw that had not seen a razor in a few days. "Most people in Helena would not know a sonnet from a horseshoe," Natalie said, unable to keep the defensive edge from her voice. The corner of his mouth lifted in something that was not quite a smile. "Most people in Helena have not had the privilege of an education. I am Harrison Everett, and I apologize for the interruption. I saw you sitting here yesterday as well, and I confess I was curious about what could hold someone's attention so completely in this particular corner of the world." He removed his hat as he spoke, a gesture of respect that seemed almost comically formal given the rough surroundings. His hands, Natalie noticed, were scarred and calloused from hard work, but he held the hat with a carefulness that suggested he understood the value of things beyond their immediate utility. "Natalie Armstrong," she replied, closing the book but keeping one finger between the pages to mark her place. "And it is simply a book, nothing mysterious about it." "Simply a book," Harrison repeated, and now he did smile, an expression that transformed his serious face into something warmer. "I have never understood people who say simply a book as though books were not entire worlds waiting to be discovered. May I?" He gestured to the ground beside her. Natalie hesitated. Every instinct told her to send him away, to protect the small bubble of peace she had carved out for herself in this harsh place. But something in his manner, in the way he had recognized Shakespeare from a distance, made her curious despite herself. "It is a free country," she said, which was not quite an invitation but not quite a refusal either. Harrison settled himself on the ground with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own body. He leaned back against the tree trunk, careful to maintain a respectful distance, and pulled something from inside his vest. It was a small, battered notebook, its leather cover stained and cracked from use. "I write," he said simply, as though this explained everything. "Mostly just thoughts and observations. Some poetry, though I would not claim to be any rival to Shakespeare. But out here, working cattle, riding fence lines, sometimes the only way to stay sane is to put words to what you are seeing and feeling." Natalie found herself looking at him with new eyes. In 3 years in Montana Territory, she had met exactly 2 men who could read beyond a basic level, and neither of them had shown any interest in literature beyond the practical. The idea that this cowboy, who looked like he had just ridden in from weeks on the range, kept a journal of poetry was so unexpected that she did not quite know how to respond. "Would you read me something?" The words were out before she could stop them, and she felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment at her own forwardness. Harrison looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he opened the notebook, his fingers gentle on the worn pages. "This is something I wrote last week, during a night watch. We were camped up in the foothills, and the stars were so bright they seemed close enough to touch." He began to read, his voice steady and surprisingly melodic. The words he had written were simple but sincere, describing the vast Montana sky and the feeling of being simultaneously insignificant and part of something greater than oneself. His poetry was not polished or sophisticated, but it carried an emotional honesty that made Natalie's chest tighten. Here was someone who saw the world the way she did, who understood that beauty and meaning could exist even in the harsh reality of frontier life. When he finished, silence settled between them, broken only by the distant sounds of Helena going about its business. Natalie realized she was gripping her book so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. "That was beautiful," she said quietly. "Truly." Harrison closed the notebook and looked at her directly. His eyes were brown, she noticed, with flecks of gold that caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the cottonwood leaves. "My turn to ask. Would you read me something from your book?" Natalie opened the volume of sonnets, finding the page she had been studying before he arrived. Her voice was softer than his, less accustomed to projecting across open spaces, but she read with feeling, letting Shakespeare's words about love and constancy fill the small space beneath the tree. As she read, she became aware of Harrison watching her, not with the predatory intensity she had learned to fear from men, but with genuine attention, as though her words mattered. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment before speaking. "I memorized that one years ago," he said. "It got me through some difficult times. The idea that real love is not subject to change or circumstance, that it is a fixed point in a changing world. I find that comforting." "Where did you learn to read like that?" Natalie asked. "To appreciate poetry and literature?" Harrison's expression grew distant. "My mother was a schoolteacher in Ohio. She made sure I had an education before she died. My father thought it was a waste of time, that a boy should be learning practical skills, but she insisted. After she passed, he brought me out here and I have been working cattle ever since. But I never stopped reading, never stopped trying to make sense of the world through words." "I understand that," Natalie said. "My father thought my reading was foolishness too. He tolerated it only because my mother encouraged it, and after she died, he was too worn down by this place to care what I did. But books have been my salvation. They remind me that there is more to life than just survival." They talked as the afternoon sun moved across the sky, trading stories of the books they had read and the ones they hoped to find someday. Harrison spoke of working on the sprawling Circle Bar Ranch 15 miles outside of Helena, of long days in the saddle and longer nights under the stars. He had been with the outfit for 5 years, saving money with a goal that he kept to himself for now. Natalie told him about her small cabin, about the struggle to make ends meet with her meager earnings from taking in sewing and doing laundry for the more prosperous families in town. "I should go," Harrison said eventually, noting the lengthening shadows. "I need to pick up supplies before the general store closes. But may I ask, will you be here tomorrow?" Natalie felt something flutter in her chest, a sensation she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. "I usually come here in the afternoons, when the day's work is done." "Then perhaps I will see you again," Harrison said, standing and dusting off his chaps. "It has been a genuine pleasure, Miss Armstrong. It is rare to find someone who understands the value of words in a place like this." "Mr. Everett," Natalie said, and he turned back to look at her. "Thank you for not treating me like I am strange, for not making me feel foolish for caring about books." His smile was warm and genuine. "Anyone who thinks you are strange for caring about books is not worth your time. I will see you tomorrow." She watched him walk away, his long stride carrying him quickly toward the main street of Helena. Only when he had disappeared from view did she realize she was still holding the book of sonnets open to the page she had read for him, and that she was smiling. True to his word, Harrison appeared the next afternoon just as Natalie was settling into her spot beneath the cottonwood tree. This time he brought his own book, a worn copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass that had clearly been read many times. They sat together in companionable silence at first, each absorbed in their own reading, but gradually they began to share passages that struck them, discussing the meanings and emotions the words evoked. This pattern continued for the next week. Every afternoon, Harrison would finish his business in town and make his way to the cottonwood tree where Natalie waited. Sometimes they read, sometimes they talked, and sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, enjoying the rare pleasure of being with someone who understood them. The people of Helena began to notice, of course. In a town of fewer than 4,000 souls, 2 people meeting regularly under a tree did not go unremarked. Mrs. Eliza Thornton, the banker's wife and self-appointed guardian of Helena's moral standards, made a point of walking past the cottonwood tree one afternoon, her mouth pursed in obvious disapproval. "Miss Armstrong," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "I hope you are being careful about your reputation. A young woman alone with a cowboy, it invites talk." Natalie felt her temper rise, but before she could respond, Harrison stood up, his voice polite but firm. "Mrs. Thornton, I assure you that Miss Armstrong and I are simply 2 people who share an interest in literature. There is nothing improper about our meetings." "Literature," Mrs. Thornton sniffed. "I am sure that is what you call it." "Mark my words, girl. No respectable man will have you if you continue to throw yourself at every cowboy who passes through town." She swept away before Natalie could formulate a response, leaving her shaking with anger and humiliation. Harrison settled back down beside her, his expression sympathetic. "Do not let her words trouble you," he said gently. "She is small-minded and bitter, and she cannot conceive of a friendship between a man and a woman that is not tainted by impropriety." "Is that what we are?" Natalie asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "Friends?" Harrison met her eyes, and she saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch. "I would like to think so, though I will confess, Natalie, that my feelings toward you have grown beyond simple friendship. But I did not want to speak of such things until I was certain you might welcome them." Her heart was racing now. "What kinds of feelings?" He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "The kind that make me count the hours until I can see you again." The kind that make me want to share every thought and experience with you. The kind that made me realize I have been waiting my whole life to meet someone who sees the world the way I do. Natalie felt tears prick at her eyes. I thought I was alone, she whispered. I thought I was the only person in this entire territory who cared about beauty and words and ideas beyond the immediate struggle to survive. And then you sat down beside me and started talking about Shakespeare, and everything changed. May I court you properly? Harrison asked. I know I am just a cowboy with little to offer beyond a small savings and a dream of someday owning my own land. But I am honest and hardworking, and I promise you I will do everything in my power to make you happy. Yes, Natalie said, squeezing his hand. Yes, I would like that very much. The kiss that followed was tentative and sweet, a gentle brushing of lips that sent warmth flooding through Natalie's entire body. When they pulled apart, Harrison was grinning like a fool, and she knew her own expression must mirror his. I have something I want to show you, Harrison said. But it will require a ride out to the ranch. Would you be comfortable with that? I can borrow a wagon from the livery, bring you out on Saturday. I promise you will be safe, and I will have you back to town well before dark. Natalie nodded, excitement and nervousness warring in her chest. I trust you. Saturday dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect June day that made Montana seem like paradise rather than purgatory. Harrison arrived at her cabin early, driving a neat buggy pulled by a matched pair of horses. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance, his face freshly shaven and his best shirt clean and pressed. The ride to the Circle Bar Ranch took them through some of the most beautiful country Natalie had ever seen. Rolling hills covered in prairie grass stretched to distant mountains, and everywhere wildflowers bloomed in riotous colors. Harrison pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the land, about the harsh winters and brief, glorious summers, about the work of running cattle in this unforgiving but magnificent place. When they arrived at the ranch, Harrison did not take her to the main house where the owner lived, but instead drove the buggy out to a small valley tucked between two hills. There, beside a clear stream, sat the foundation of a house, newly laid stone marking out rooms and walls. This is mine, Harrison said, helping her down from the buggy. I have been saving for 6 years, and I finally had enough to buy this section of land from the ranch owner. He is getting older and does not want to manage as much property, so he sold it to me at a fair price. I have been working on the foundation in my spare time, planning to build slowly as I can afford the materials. Natalie walked around the foundation, seeing in her mind's eye the house that would someday stand here. It was modest in size but well planned, with a main room, separate bedroom, and a kitchen area. This room here, Harrison said, pointing to a smaller space off the main room. I thought it could be a library, a place for books, for reading and writing. A place where words and ideas would be valued as much as the practical work of ranching. She turned to look at him, understanding the full weight of what he was showing her. You are building this for us. I am building it with hope, Harrison said. Hope that you might someday want to share it with me. I know it is too soon to speak of marriage, that we have known each other barely 2 weeks. But Natalie, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. You are the person I have been searching for without even knowing I was searching. And I want to build a life with you, if you will have me. Natalie looked around at the valley, at the stream and the distant mountains, at the foundation of a house that included a library. She thought about her small cabin in Helena, about the loneliness that had been her constant companion for 3 years, about the unexpected miracle of finding someone who understood her completely. It is fast, she said slowly. People will talk, will say we barely know each other. People will always talk, Harrison replied. "The question is, what does your heart say?" Natalie closed her eyes, listening to the wind in the grass and the burble of the stream. When she opened them, Harrison was watching her with an expression of such hope and vulnerability that it made her chest ache. "My heart says yes," she told him. "My heart says that I have spent 3 years in Montana feeling like I was slowly dying inside, and then you sat down beside me under a tree, and everything came back to life. My heart says that 2 weeks can be enough when you meet the right person. So yes, Harrison Everett, I will marry you, and I will help you build this house, and I will fill that library with books, and we will make a life together in this valley." The kiss he gave her then was nothing like the tentative brush of lips under the cottonwood tree. This was a kiss full of promise and passion, a claiming and a giving all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Natalie was laughing with pure joy. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning, walking the property and talking about the future they would build together. Harrison showed her where he wanted to put a barn and corrals for horses, where a vegetable garden could be planted near the stream. They talked about the work that would need to be done, the challenges they would face, but also about the books they would read together, the children they might have someday, the life that stretched before them full of possibility. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Harrison reluctantly said they needed to head back to Helena. "I do not want to damage your reputation any more than it already has been by our meetings," he said, "as much as I want to keep you here forever." "Then let us not wait too long to marry," Natalie said practically. "I have no family to plan for, no society to please. We could be married quickly if you wish." "Next month," Harrison said. "Give me 1 month to finish the roof on the house so we have shelter, and to make sure I have enough supplies laid in." "Will you marry me in July, Natalie Armstrong?" "I will marry you in July," she agreed. The month that followed was a whirlwind of activity. Harrison divided his time between his regular duties at the Circle Bar Ranch and working on the house in every spare moment. The other cowboys pitched in to help, perhaps moved by the obvious happiness of their normally reserved colleague. Natalie spent her days sewing curtains and linens, selling off the furniture from her cabin that they would not need, and enduring the scandalized whispers of Helena's more respectable citizens. Not everyone disapproved, though. The saloon owner, a weathered woman named Sarah who had come west as a dance hall girl and built her own empire through grit and determination, stopped Natalie on the street one day. "Do not let the pearl clutchers get you down," Sarah said, her voice rough from years of tobacco and whiskey. "You are doing what every woman out here should do, taking your happiness where you find it. That cowboy of yours has good eyes. He looks at you like you are water in the desert. That is worth more than all the approval of Mrs. Thornton and her kind." Natalie thanked her, touched by the unexpected support. She was learning that Helena, like any community, had its own social strata and complications, but also that there was room for those who were willing to make their own way regardless of what others thought. Harrison came to town every few days, always finding time to sit with Natalie under the cottonwood tree. They continued to raid together, but now they also planned their wedding and future in detail. It would be a simple ceremony, performed by the circuit judge who came through Helena once a month. They would invite a few friends, have a small meal afterward, and then head out to their valley to begin their married life. "I want to read you something," Harrison said one evening, pulling out his battered notebook. "I have been working on it all week." Natalie set aside her own book and gave him her full attention. Harrison's voice was slightly unsteady as he began to read, and she realized he was nervous about sharing this particular piece of writing. The poem he had written was about her, about the day he had first seen her reading under the cottonwood tree. He described the way the sunlight had caught in her dark hair, the expression of complete absorption on her face, the sense that he was witnessing something precious and rare. He wrote about gathering his courage to approach her, about the fear that she would reject him or mock his interest in literature. And then he wrote about the miracle of discovering that she understood him, that she saw him not as just a cowboy but as a complete person with thoughts and feelings and dreams. By the time he finished, Natalie was crying openly. "That is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Will you write it down for me so I can keep it forever?" "I will write you 1,000 poems," Harrison promised. "One for every day of our lives together, if that is what you want." "I just want you," Natalie said. "Everything else is extra." The wedding day arrived hot and clear, the sky that particular shade of blue that only seemed to exist in Montana. Natalie wore a simple dress of pale yellow that she had sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair that Harrison had picked that morning. Harrison wore his best suit, slightly too tight across the shoulders from years of ranch work, his hair neatly combed and his boots polished to a shine. The ceremony took place in the small church at the edge of Helena, with perhaps 20 people in attendance. Sarah from the saloon was there, along with several of Harrison's fellow cowboys and a few of the more open-minded townspeople who were happy to see two young people in love. Mrs. Thornton was notably absent, which suited both bride and groom perfectly. Judge William Foster, a portly man with kind eyes and a booming voice, performed the ceremony with warmth and humor. "I have married a lot of people in my years traveling this territory," he said, "but I cannot recall ever seeing two people who looked more certain about what they were doing. Harrison and Natalie, the frontier is a hard place and marriage is hard work, but I have a feeling you two are going to do just fine." When Harrison slipped the simple gold band onto Natalie's finger, his hands were steady, but she could see emotion shining in his eyes. "I promise to honor you, to respect your mind and heart, to read with you and build with you, and to love you for all my days," he said, adding his own vows to those the judge had spoken. Natalie's voice was clear and strong. "I promise to be your partner in all things, to support your dreams, to share your burdens, and to love you with everything I am, from this day forward. Then, by the authority vested in me by Montana territory, I pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Foster declared. "Harrison, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was tender and full of promise, and when they pulled apart to the applause of their small gathering, Natalie felt as though she might burst from happiness. The meal afterward was held at Sarah's saloon, which she had cleared of her usual rough clientele for the occasion. There was roasted chicken and potatoes, fresh bread and butter, and even a small cake that Sarah had commissioned from the town's only baker. The cowboys entertained everyone with stories about Harrison, most of which were designed to make him blush, and partially succeeded. One of them, a grizzled man named Tom who had been working cattle since before Montana was even a territory, stood up to make a toast. "I have known Harrison for 5 years," Tom said, "and in all that time, I never once heard him complain about the work or the conditions or anything else that makes most men miserable. But I also never saw him truly happy, not until he met Natalie. So here is to finding the person who makes you whole, and to building a life worth living in this beautiful, terrible place we call home." Everyone raised their glasses, and Natalie felt Harrison squeeze her hand under the table. As the afternoon wore on and the light began to slant toward evening, they said their goodbyes and climbed into the buggy for the ride to their valley. This time, Natalie's few possessions were loaded in the back, everything she owned in the world reduced to a trunk of books, her sewing kit, and a few kitchen implements. The house was small but solid, the roof completed just 2 days before as Harrison had promised. Inside, he had built a bed frame and a table, rough but sturdy. The stove he had installed was second-hand but serviceable, and the windows had real glass, a luxury in this part of the territory. And true to his word, there was a separate room lined with shelves waiting to be filled with books. "It is not much yet," Harrison said, suddenly seeming nervous, "but we will add to it over time, make it into a real home." Natalie turned to him and put her arms around his neck. "It is already a home because you are here. Everything else is just details." They spent their first night as husband and wife learning each other. Tentative at first, but growing bolder as passion and trust overcame nervousness. Harrison was gentle and patient, and Natalie found that physical intimacy with someone who truly loved and respected her was nothing like the cold, transactional encounters she had heard other women whisper about. This was a joining of not just bodies but hearts and minds, a culmination of everything they had been building since that first afternoon under the cottonwood tree. Afterward, as they lay together in the darkness with the sounds of the Montana night drifting through the open window, Harrison traced patterns on her shoulder and spoke softly. "I used to think that a life spent working cattle and saving money was enough. That I did not need anything more than the work and the land and my books. But you have shown me what I was missing, Natalie. You have shown me that sharing life with someone makes everything richer and more meaningful." "We will build something wonderful here," Natalie replied, her voice drowsy and content. "Not just a house and a ranch, but a life full of beauty and words and love. We will prove that you can be both practical and poetic, that you can work hard and still make time for the things that feed the soul." "Speaking of feeding things," Harrison said with a quiet laugh, "I should probably warn you that I am a terrible cook. One of the things I am most looking forward to about being married is eating food that does not taste like boot leather." Natalie poked him in the ribs. "Then you are in luck because I am an excellent cook. Though you will be expected to help, I did not marry you to be your servant." "I would not want you to be," Harrison said seriously. "I want you as my partner, Natalie, in all things always." The summer months that followed were a time of intense work, but also deep happiness. Harrison continued to work for the Circle Bar Ranch while also building up their own small operation. They started with just a few head of cattle, animals he had bought from his former employer, and 2 good horses. The days were long and physically demanding, with Natalie learning the skills of ranch life while also managing the household and the large vegetable garden she had planted near the stream. But every evening, no matter how tired they were, they made time to read together. Sometimes it was just for half an hour before exhaustion claimed them, but that ritual of sharing words and ideas became the foundation of their marriage. They read novels and poetry, newspapers and agricultural journals, anything they could get their hands on. Harrison ordered books from catalogs, a luxury they could barely afford but both considered essential, and their library slowly began to fill. As summer turned to fall, and the mountains began to be dusted with snow, Natalie realized that she had not had her monthly courses in some time. When she told Harrison her suspicions, his face transformed with wonder and joy. "A baby," he breathed. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Natalie asked, suddenly nervous. They had talked about children in an abstract way but had not planned for one quite so soon. Harrison pulled her into his arms. "I am overjoyed. Terrified but overjoyed. We are going to be parents, Natalie. We are going to raise a child who will grow up surrounded by books and love and the beauty of this valley." The pregnancy progressed without major complications. though the Montana winter was brutal. There were days when they could barely leave the house due to blizzards, when the cold was so intense that water froze solid within minutes of being brought inside. But the house Harrison had built was tight and warm, and they had laid in adequate supplies. Those long winter nights gave them even more time to read and talk, to plan for the future, and to deepen the bond that had formed so quickly but felt unshakable. Natalie craved stories during her pregnancy, devouring every book in their small library, and then reading them again. Harrison read aloud to her for hours, his voice a comforting presence as she sewed tiny clothes and blankets for the baby that was growing inside her. They talked about names and hopes, about the kind of parents they wanted to be, about how they would make sure their child had both the practical skills needed for frontier life and an appreciation for beauty and learning. "I want our children to know that they can be anything," Natalie said one evening, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "That being educated and cultured does not make you less capable of surviving in this world. It makes you more capable. That words and ideas have power, but so do your hands and your courage. They will know," Harrison assured her, "because they will see it in you every day. You are the strongest person I know, Natalie. You adapted to ranch life without complaint. You learned skills that were completely foreign to you, and you never once gave up the things that make you who you are. That is the example our children will grow up with." When spring arrived and the snow began to melt, Natalie's time drew near. They had arranged for a midwife from Helena to come stay with them for the last few weeks, a practical woman named Margaret who had delivered half the babies in the territory. Margaret arrived in mid-April, pronouncing Natalie healthy and strong and predicting an easy birth. She was wrong about the easy part. Natalie labored for nearly 20 hours, a time of such pain and exhaustion that she honestly thought she might die. But Harrison stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, reading poetry to her during the brief respites between contractions. His presence gave her strength, and when their son finally arrived in the early morning hours, red-faced and squalling, Natalie felt a surge of love so powerful it overwhelmed everything else. "A boy," Margaret announced, placing the baby on Natalie's chest. A big, healthy boy with a fine set of lungs. Harrison was crying openly, his calloused hand gently touching the baby's downy head. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Natalie, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Henry, after Harrison's mother Helen, and from the moment he entered the world, he changed everything. The first months were exhausting as they adjusted to life with an infant who needed constant care. But even in the midst of the sleepless nights and endless feedings, there was joy. Harrison would walk the floor with Henry when Natalie needed rest, singing softly or reciting poetry he had memorized. Natalie would nurse the baby while reading, determined not to let motherhood completely subsume her identity. As Henry grew from a helpless infant into a curious baby who could sit up and grasp objects, they began to share books with him, showing him pictures and reading aloud even though he could not possibly understand the words yet. It was never too early, they believed, to surround him with language and stories. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily. Harrison was an excellent cattleman, and his reputation for honesty and hard work brought opportunities. Other ranchers began to hire him for specialized jobs, knowing he would do quality work. The money he earned went into buying more cattle, better equipment, improvements to the house. They added another room when Henry was 6 months old, giving them more space and acknowledging that there would likely be more children in the future. When Henry was 2 years old, Natalie became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect, and in the spring of 1884 they welcomed a daughter they named Naomi. She was smaller than Henry had been, but just as healthy, with her father's brown eyes and her mother's dark hair. "Now we have one of each," Harrison said, holding his daughter with the careful confidence of a parent who had done this before. "Though I would not object to more if you are willing." Natalie laughed, still exhausted from the birth but happy. "Ask me again in a year or two. Right now, I am content with these two." Life fell into a rhythm, the seasons marked by the work of the ranch and the growth of their children. Henry learned to walk and then to talk, his vocabulary unusually advanced because his parents spoke to him like a person rather than a baby. He loved books as much as they did, demanding stories constantly and studying the pictures with intense concentration. Naomi was quieter but just as observant, watching everything with her serious eyes. When Henry was 4, Harrison began teaching him to ride, starting with a gentle old mare they had acquired specifically for this purpose. Natalie insisted that he also begin learning his letters, and soon the morning routine included lessons at the kitchen table before the day's work began. Henry soaked up knowledge like a sponge, and his parents took turns teaching him, sharing the joy of watching his mind develop and expand. The ranch continued to grow, and their reputation in the territory grew with it. People knew Harrison and Natalie Everett as hard workers who kept their word, who treated their employees fairly, and who somehow managed to maintain a library and intellectual life in the midst of ranching. It was unusual enough to be remarkable, but they had earned enough respect that few people openly criticized their choices anymore. On Henry's 5th birthday, something happened that brought the violence of the frontier crashing back into their peaceful valley. Harrison had gone to Helena for supplies, taking Henry with him as a special treat. Natalie was home with Naomi, who was napping, when 3 men rode up to the house. She recognized trouble immediately in their body language, in the way they looked around the property with assessing eyes. "Afternoon," the leader said, not bothering to dismount. He was a rough-looking man with cold eyes and a gun worn low on his hip. "This the Everett place?" Natalie's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. "It is. My husband is not here at the moment. Can I help you with something?" "Heard tell you folks have been doing well for yourselves. Heard you got some money saved up." The man's smile was not friendly. "We are collecting donations for a worthy cause. Figured you might want to contribute." It was a robbery, thinly veiled in polite words. Natalie felt fear spike through her but forced herself to think. The rifle was inside the house, too far to reach before they could react. Her best chance was to stall until Harrison returned, though she had no idea when that would be. "We do not keep money at the house," she said, which was true. Their savings were in the bank in Helena. "My husband handles all the finances." The leader's eyes narrowed. "That is unfortunate. Maybe we will just wait for him then. Boys, get down and make yourselves comfortable." The other 2 men dismounted, and Natalie saw her options narrowing. But before the situation could escalate, she heard hoofbeats approaching fast. Harrison and Henry came around the bend in the road, and Harrison immediately sized up the situation. He reined in his horse, positioning himself between the strangers and his family. "I am Harrison Everett," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel underneath. "Whatever you want, you can discuss it with me. Leave my wife alone," the leader laughed. "Your wife was just telling us about your financial situation. We are hoping you will be more forthcoming." "I have $20 in my pocket," Harrison said. "Take it and leave. That is all you are getting from us." Natalie could see the tension in Harrison's shoulders, could see him calculating distances and odds. Henry, sitting in front of his father on the horse, was wide-eyed and silent, Sensing the danger even if he did not fully understand it, the leader considered for a moment, then shook his head. $20 is not much of a donation for a property like this. I think we will take a look around, see what else might be valuable. I do not think you will, a new voice said, and Natalie's head whipped around to see Tom, Harrison's former colleague from the Circle Bar Ranch, riding up with two other cowboys. They were all armed, and their expressions left no doubt about their intentions. The situation had suddenly shifted. 3 against 1 was manageable odds for the robbers, but 3 against 4, with the 4 being experienced ranch hands who knew how to use their weapons, was a different matter entirely. "Seems like we interrupted something," Tom said conversationally, though his hand rested near his gun. "These fellas friends of yours, Harrison?" "Just leaving," Harrison said, his eyes never leaving the leader. The robbers looked at each other, clearly weighing their options. Finally, the leader spat on the ground and swung back into his saddle. "This is not worth the trouble. But you all might want to watch your backs. These mountains are dangerous places." They rode off, and only when they had disappeared from sight did Natalie allow herself to breathe properly. Harrison dismounted and handed Henry down to Tom, then walked quickly to Natalie and pulled her into his arms. "Are you all right? Did they hurt you?" "I am fine," Natalie said, though she was shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "They just arrived. I was trying to stall them until you got back." Tom and his companions had dismounted as well. "We saw those 3 in town acting suspicious," Tom explained. "Figured they might be planning trouble, so we followed them out this way. Good thing we did." "Thank you," Harrison said, his voice rough with emotion. "I owe you." "You do not owe me anything," Tom replied. "You are good people, and good people need to look out for each other in this territory, but you might want to think about getting yourself some help around here. 3 men alone, your wife and kids vulnerable when you are gone. It is not safe, Harrison." It was a conversation they had that night after the children were asleep, their voices low but intense. Natalie knew Tom was right, but the idea of bringing outsiders onto their property, into their carefully built sanctuary, was difficult to accept. "We could hire 1 or 2 men," Harrison said. "Young cowboys looking for steady work. We have enough cattle now to justify the expense, and it would mean I could spend more time here, more time with you and the children." "We would have to build them a bunkhouse," Natalie pointed out. "We do not have room in the house." "I could do that over the summer," Harrison said. "I have been thinking about expanding anyway. We need more space as the children grow, and if we are going to hire hands, they need proper accommodation." So they expanded again, this time significantly. Harrison and a crew of hired carpenters added a whole wing to the house, giving Henry and Naomi their own bedrooms and adding a real dining room separate from the kitchen. They also built a small but comfortable bunkhouse for ranch hands. By the end of that summer, they had hired 2 young men, both in their early 20s, who were grateful for steady employment and good treatment. Life became busier but also more secure. With help to handle the daily ranch work, Harrison had more time for his family and for the intellectual pursuits that fed his soul. He and Natalie still read together every evening, a tradition they had maintained without exception since their wedding night. The children often fell asleep to the sound of their parents' voices reading poetry or discussing philosophy, and it became as much a part of the rhythm of their home as meals and bedtimes. Henry grew into a bright, curious boy who could read by the age of 5, and was working through increasingly complex books by the time he was 7. Naomi was quieter but just as intelligent, preferring to observe and think before speaking. When she did offer an opinion, it was usually well considered and insightful. They were both learning to ride and rope, to handle the practical aspects of ranch life, but they were also learning Latin and mathematics, literature and history. When Henry was 8 and Naomi was 6, a traveling teacher stopped at their ranch, having heard about the Everett family and their reputation for valuing education. Professor Charles Martin had been a university instructor in Philadelphia before coming west for his health, and he made his living now tutoring the children of wealthy ranchers and mine owners. "I have heard remarkable things about your children," he told Harrison and Natalie over coffee in their parlor, "that they are receiving a quality of education unusual for this part of the country. I wondered if you might be interested in having me assess their progress, perhaps offer some guidance on their curriculum." Natalie exchanged glances with Harrison. They had been teaching the children themselves, using books and their own knowledge, but they had sometimes worried that they might be missing important elements of a proper education. "We would appreciate that," Natalie said. "We want the best for our children, but we are not professional educators." Professor Martin spent 3 days at the ranch, testing Henry and Naomi in various subjects and observing their studies. On the evening of the 3rd day, he sat down with their parents looking impressed. "Your children are remarkably well educated," he told them. "Henry is reading at a level I would expect from a 12 or 13-year-old, and his comprehension is excellent. Naomi is equally advanced for her age. Their mathematics are solid, their knowledge of history and literature is broad, and perhaps most impressively, they can think critically and express their ideas clearly. You have done an exceptional job with them." "Thank you," Harrison said, clearly proud. "We have tried to teach them that learning is a joy, not a chore, that education opens up the world. It shows," Professor Martin said. "I would like to propose something. I will be in this area for the next few months, working with several families. What if I were to come here once a week to work with your children? I would not charge my usual rate, as I am fascinated by what you have accomplished and would consider it a privilege to contribute. I could help ensure they are prepared should they choose to pursue higher education in the future." It was an offer they could not refuse, and so began a new chapter in their lives. Every Tuesday, Professor Martin would arrive to spend the day working with Henry and Naomi, pushing them academically while also giving Harrison and Natalie validation that their approach to education was sound. The professor became a friend as well as a teacher, often staying for dinner and engaging in long conversations about literature, philosophy, and politics. The years continued to pass, marked by the slow but steady growth of the ranch and the rapid growth of the children. They added more cattle, bought adjacent land when it became available, built a proper barn to replace the ramshackle structure that had served them initially. The library that Harrison had planned into the original house was now filled floor to ceiling with books, a collection that had become locally famous. People would sometimes travel considerable distances just to borrow books from the Everetts, and Natalie started an informal lending system, keeping careful records of who had what. Henry grew tall and lean like his father, with the same thoughtful eyes and quiet manner. He was equally comfortable discussing Shakespeare and roping cattle, moving easily between intellectual pursuits and physical work. Naomi developed into a young woman of remarkable self-possession, with a sharp wit and a love of science that led her to conduct experiments in a corner of the barn that her parents had designated as her laboratory. When Henry was 15, a prestigious boarding school in Boston wrote to offer him a scholarship. They had heard about the young man in Montana Territory who could quote classical literature and solve complex mathematical equations despite growing up on a cattle ranch. It was an opportunity that most families would have jumped at immediately, but the Everetts discussed it carefully, including Henry in the conversation. "It would be an amazing education," Harrison said. "Better than anything we can provide here, with resources and teachers and other students at your level. But it would also mean leaving home for years," Natalie added. "Missing so much of your sisters growing up, missing the ranch, missing us. We want you to have every opportunity, Henry, but we also want you to know that we will support whatever you decide." Henry thought about it for days, weighing the options. Finally, he came to his parents with his decision. "I want to stay here," he said. "I know the education in Boston would be excellent, but I would be learning things from books that I can learn from books here. What I cannot learn anywhere else is how to be the kind of man you are, Father. How to run a ranch with integrity, how to balance work and learning, how to build a life that honors both the practical and the profound. Professor Martin says he can prepare me for university entrance exams if I decide to go later. For now, I want to be here." Natalie cried when he said this, and Harrison pulled both of them into a tight embrace. "You have become an exceptional young man," he told his son. "We are proud of you beyond words." Naomi, listening from the doorway, smiled. She had not wanted her brother to leave, though she would have supported him if he had decided to go. The four of them remained a tight unit, bound not just by blood, but by shared values and genuine affection. When Natalie was 38 and Harrison 42, they had one more surprise. Natalie had assumed she was done having children, that Henry and Naomi would be their only two. So when the familiar signs began again, she was shocked. This pregnancy was harder than the previous two, her body older and less resilient, but she was also surrounded by support. Naomi, now 14, was old enough to help significantly, and Harrison was even more attentive than he had been with the first two pregnancies. They had a daughter in the spring of 1895, and they named her Hope, because that was what she represented. Hope that life could still surprise you with joy, that love could continue to grow and deepen, that families could expand in unexpected ways. Henry, now 17, was protective and gentle with his baby sister, and Naomi appointed herself Hope's guardian and teacher. The ranch was now well established and prosperous. They employed 6 regular hands and hired additional help during roundups and cattle drives. The house had been expanded twice more, and now included a wraparound porch where Harrison and Natalie would sit in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains and talking about everything and nothing. The library had expanded into 2 rooms, and people came from all over the territory to see the famous Everett collection. On their 20th wedding anniversary in July of 1901, Harrison and Natalie took a rare day away from the ranch to ride back to Helena together. They visited the cottonwood tree where they had first met, which was still standing strong after all these years. "You remember that first day?" Harrison asked, settling down in the shade just as he had 2 decades before. "I was so nervous approaching you. I had been watching you read for 3 days, working up the courage to speak to you." 3 days, Natalie laughed. "I had no idea. I thought it was a spontaneous decision." "Nothing about meeting you was spontaneous," Harrison said. "It felt like fate, like everything in my life had been leading to that moment when I would sit down beside a beautiful woman reading Shakespeare and find my entire future." Natalie leaned her head on his shoulder. "We have built something wonderful, have we not? Not just the ranch and the material success, but the life itself. The children, the books, the knowledge that we have stayed true to who we are even while adapting to this place." "We have," Harrison agreed, "and we did it by holding fast to what matters most." Love, integrity, the belief that a person can be both practical and poetic. You taught me that, Natalie. Or maybe we taught each other. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the people of Helena go about their business. The town had grown considerably since they had first met, was now moving toward becoming a city with electric lights and telephones, and all the trappings of modern civilization. But some things remained constant. The Montana sky, the mountains in the distance, the value of a good book and a true heart. "I want to read you something," Harrison said, pulling out a notebook from his jacket. It was not the battered original he had carried 20 years ago, which had been filled and preserved as a treasure. This was a newer volume, but equally well worn from constant use. He read her a poem he had written, one that traced the arc of their life together, from that first meeting under the cottonwood tree to the present day. It spoke of children and cattle, of books and buildings, of two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that honored both the demands of survival and the needs of the soul. His voice was deeper now than it had been at 26, weathered by time and use, but still capable of conveying great emotion. When he finished, Natalie was crying quietly, as she still did whenever his words moved her deeply. 20 years, she said. 20 years, and I love you more now than I did the day we married. How is that possible? Because real love grows, Harrison said, echoing the sonnet they had discussed that first day. It is not subject to change or circumstance. It deepens and expands with every shared experience, every challenge overcome together, every moment of joy and sorrow. We have been so lucky, Natalie, to find each other, to build this life, to watch our children grow into remarkable people. They stayed under the cottonwood tree for hours, reading to each other from books they had brought, talking about their plans for the future, simply enjoying each other's company as they had been doing for 2 decades. When they finally headed back to the ranch, the sun was low in the sky, painting everything in gold and amber. Henry had taken over much of the daily management of the ranch by then, showing the same combination of practical skill and thoughtful leadership that his father had modeled. He was courting a young woman from a neighboring ranch, a bright and capable girl named Alice, who shared his love of books and horses in equal measure. Natalie approved heartily, seeing in Alice the same qualities she valued in herself: strength, intelligence, and independence of spirit. Naomi, at 21, had gone to university, one of the few women in her class studying the natural sciences. She came home during summers and worked on research projects that she somehow managed to combine with ranch work. She had a particular interest in animal husbandry and was experimenting with different breeding strategies for their cattle, keeping meticulous records and analyzing the results with scientific rigor. Hope, at 6 years old, was already showing signs of having inherited her parents' love of learning. She could read simple books and spent hours following her siblings around, asking endless questions about everything. She was the joy of their later years, a reminder that life could still surprise and delight. As Harrison and Natalie grew older, they found that their love continued to evolve but never diminished. There was a comfort now in their relationship, a deep knowledge of each other that came from decades of shared life. But there was also still passion, still the ability to surprise each other, still the intellectual connection that had drawn them together in the first place. They continued their evening reading ritual without fail, though now they were sometimes joined by Hope, who would cuddle between them and listen, even when the material was far above her comprehension level. They had read through their entire library multiple times and were constantly seeking new books, new ideas, new perspectives to discuss and debate. when Henry married Alice in a ceremony at the ranch in 1903. It was a joyful celebration that brought together everyone who had been part of the Everett family's journey. Tom, now in his 70s and retired from active ranch work, gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying at the same time. Professor Martin, still teaching though considerably older, spoke about the privilege of having watched Henry grow from a boy into a man of character and intelligence. And Harrison and Natalie stood together, their fingers intertwined, watching their son embark on his own journey of love and partnership. "It feels like just yesterday that it was us," Natalie whispered to Harrison. "It was a lifetime ago and just yesterday," Harrison replied. Time is strange that way. Henry and Alice built their own house on the ranch property, a smaller version of the main house but with its own library, of course. They took over more of the daily operations, allowing Harrison to step back gradually. He was 53 now, still strong but feeling the accumulated effects of decades of hard physical work. He was content to let the younger generation take the lead while he focused on the things that had always brought him the most joy: reading, writing, spending time with Natalie, and watching his children and future grandchildren flourish. Naomi finished her university education and surprised everyone by deciding to return to the ranch permanently. "I realized," she told her parents, "that I was studying animal science in abstract, but here I can actually apply it. I can make a real difference to our operation and to the territory. Why would I stay in some university laboratory when I can do meaningful work here?" She took over a section of the ranch to implement her breeding programs and experiments, turning their cattle operation into one of the most scientifically advanced in the territory. She never married, claiming she was too busy with her work, but she seemed completely content with her life choices. Her parents supported her fully, proud that she was forging her own path regardless of social expectations. Hope grew into a lovely girl who shared her mother's dark hair and her father's thoughtful brown eyes. She was quieter than either of her siblings had been, but with an inner strength that revealed itself in unexpected ways. She loved music in addition to books, and Harrison bought a piano that had to be transported from Helena with enormous difficulty and expense. But watching Hope's face light up as she learned to play made every bit of trouble worthwhile. On the evening of their 30th wedding anniversary in 1911, Harrison and Natalie found themselves once again on the porch of their ranch house, surrounded by family. Henry and Alice had 2 children now, making Harrison and Natalie grandparents. Naomi was there with reports of her latest breeding success. Hope, now 16, was playing the piano inside, the music drifting through the open windows. The ranch hands had been given the evening off, and the valley was peaceful in the fading light. 30 years, Harrison said, shaking his head in wonder. When I was 26 years old, working cattle and writing bad poetry in my spare time, I could not have imagined this. Could not have imagined you or the children or this life we built. Your poetry was never bad, Natalie protested, as she had been doing for 3 decades. Harrison laughed, the sound warm and familiar. It was terrible and you know it, but it improved over the years, mostly because I had better subject matter. How could my writing not improve when I had you as my muse? They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to Hope play. Then Natalie said, "I was thinking today about that afternoon when Mrs. Thornton scolded me for meeting with you under the cottonwood tree. Do you remember? She was so concerned about my reputation." "I remember," Harrison said. "She was certain you were ruining your life by associating with a mere cowboy. I wonder what she would think if she could see us now," Natalie mused. A prosperous ranch, educated children, a library that people travel to see. We proved her wrong about everything. We proved that you can build a life on your own terms, Harrison corrected. That loving books does not make you impractical. That being educated does not make you unfit for frontier life. That two people who value the same things can create something lasting and meaningful. He pulled out yet another notebook, this one showing its age. I've been working on something for today. Will you indulge me? Natalie smiled. Always. Harrison read her a poem that synthesized everything they had been to each other over 30 years. It spoke of growth and change, of challenges overcome and joys shared, of the way love could be both the foundation and the superstructure of a life well lived. He wrote about her strength and grace, about the way she had adapted to ranch life without losing her essential self, about the children they had raised and the legacy they were building together. When he finished, they were both crying, but they were happy tears. The tears of people who had been granted more than they had ever dared to hope for, who had found in each other not just a partner but a true soulmate. I love you, Natalie said simply. I have loved you since the day you sat down beside me and started talking about Shakespeare. I will love you until the day I die and beyond, if such things are possible. They are possible, Harrison said firmly. Love like ours transcends everything, even death. But we are not thinking about death tonight. Tonight we are celebrating 30 years of life and love and laughter. 30 years of reading together, of building together, of being together. They stayed on the porch long after everyone else had gone to bed, holding hands and watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. The same sky Harrison had written about in his journal that night so many years ago. The sky that had witnessed their courtship and marriage and the raising of their children. The years that followed were gentle ones. Harrison and Natalie grew old together, their love deepening with each passing season. They watched Henry and Alice's children grow, teaching them to read as they had taught their own children, passing on the love of literature and learning to a new generation. Naomi's breeding program became famous throughout the territory and beyond, bringing recognition and prosperity to the ranch. Hope went away to a music conservatory but returned regularly, eventually settling in Helena where she taught piano and gave concerts. When Harrison turned 65 in 1912, he officially retired from active ranch work, though he still spent time outside every day, unable to completely give up the physical connection to the land. He devoted more time to his writing, producing a volume of poetry that was published by a small press in San Francisco. The book did not make him famous or wealthy, but it brought him satisfaction to see his words in print, to know that others might be moved by the thoughts and feelings he had been recording for decades. Natalie, at 61, remained active and engaged. She continued to manage the lending library, which had become an institution in the region. She corresponded with people all over the country, discussing books and ideas, maintaining connections with the wider intellectual world even from her remote valley in Montana. Her hair had gone completely silver, but her mind was as sharp as ever, her love of learning undiminished by age. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1921 with a large gathering that brought together family and friends from across Montana and beyond. Professor Martin, now in his 80s and frail but still intellectually vigorous, traveled from Helena to be there. Tom had passed away several years earlier, but his son attended, along with many of the other people who had been part of their story over the decades. At the celebration, Harrison stood to make a speech. His voice was not as strong as it once had been, but it still carried authority and warmth. 40 years ago, he said, I was a cowboy with nothing but a dream and a notebook full of mediocre poetry. Then I met a woman sitting under a cottonwood tree, reading Shakespeare, and everything changed. Natalie saw past the dusty clothes and sunburned face to the person I was inside. She took a chance on me, on us, on the possibility that two people who loved words and ideas could build a life together in this beautiful, harsh place. And look what we have created. Not just a successful ranch, though we have that. Not just a family, though we have been blessed with remarkable children and grandchildren. But a life that honors both the practical and the profound, that proves you do not have to choose between survival and beauty, between hard work and intellectual growth. We have shown that it is possible to live fully, to embrace both the challenges of frontier life and the joys of literature and learning. He turned to Natalie, who was sitting beside him with tears streaming down her face. "You are my greatest blessing," he said directly to her. "My partner, my inspiration, my love. Everything good in my life flows from that afternoon when I gathered my courage and sat down beside you. Thank you for 39 years, 11 months, and however many days of happiness. Thank you for being exactly who you are." The celebration continued late into the night with music and dancing and storytelling. But eventually, Harrison and Natalie slipped away to their bedroom, tired but happy. They lay together in the darkness, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been for 4 decades. "You ever regret it?" Harrison asked quietly. "Marrying me instead of waiting for someone with more education, more refinement, more to offer." Natalie propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, her eyes fierce even in the darkness. "How can you ask me that after 40 years? You are the most educated, refined person I know, Harrison Everett. Not because of where you went to school or what degrees you have, but because of who you are. You never stopped learning, never stopped trying to understand the world and express what you found. You built me a house with a library. You read to me every night without fail. You raised children who love books and ideas as much as they love this ranch. You wrote me poems that captured truths I did not even know I was feeling. What more could I possibly have wanted?" "I love you," Harrison said, pulling her close. "I will always love you." They fell asleep like that, holding each other, two people who had been lucky enough to find exactly what they needed in this world. The years continued to pass. Harrison's health began to decline gradually, the result of decades of hard physical labor and the simple fact of aging. He developed a persistent cough that worried Natalie, though he insisted it was nothing serious. But by 1924, when he was 77 years old, it became clear that he was failing. The doctor from Helena came to examine him and spoke privately with Natalie afterward. "His heart is worn out," the doctor said gently. "He has worked hard his entire life, and his body is simply giving out. I do not think it will be long now. I am sorry." Natalie accepted the news with the same quiet strength she had shown throughout her life. She arranged things so that Harrison could be comfortable, setting up their bed in the library so he could be surrounded by his beloved books. The family gathered, Henry and Alice bringing the grandchildren, Naomi leaving her experiments to be by her father's side, Hope coming from Helena with her husband and young children. Harrison was weak but lucid, able to speak with each of them, to give them his blessings and advice. To Henry, he said, "You have become everything I hoped you would be. Run this ranch with integrity, teach your children the way you were taught, and never forget that success means nothing if you lose sight of what truly matters." To Naomi, he said, "You have always forged your own path, and I am so proud of you for that. Keep asking questions, keep pushing boundaries, keep showing the world that women are capable of anything." To Hope, he said, "Your music has brought so much joy to our lives. Keep sharing that gift with the world. Beauty and art are not luxuries, they are necessities. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. And to his grandchildren he said simply, read. Read everything you can get your hands on. The world is wider and more wonderful than you can possibly imagine, and books are the key to understanding it. But most of his remaining strength was saved for Natalie. When they were finally alone together, he took her hand and pulled her close. I need you to promise me something, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Anything, Natalie replied, tears streaming down her face. Promise me you will keep living. Keep reading, keep learning, keep connecting with people. Do not let my death be the end of your story. You have so much still to give, so much life still to live. I do not know how to be in this world without you, Natalie said honestly. Yes, you do, Harrison insisted. You were a complete person before you met me, and you will be a complete person after I am gone. We have had 43 years together, which is more than most people get, and every single one of those years has been a gift. But your story does not end with mine, my love. Promise me. I promise, Natalie whispered. Harrison relaxed back into the pillows, a slight smile on his face. Read me something, he requested. One more time. Read me Sonnet 116, the one you were reading the day we met. Natalie picked up the worn volume of Shakespeare, the same book she had been reading under the cottonwood tree all those years ago. Her voice shook as she began to read, but she made it through the entire sonnet, that meditation on love as an unchanging constant in a changing world. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, she read, and the words had never felt more true or more painful when she finished. Harrison's eyes were closed, but he was still breathing, still present. That is us, he whispered. That has always been us. A marriage of true minds. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for everything. He died early the next morning, just as the sun was rising over the mountains. Natalie was lying beside him, her head on his shoulder, and she felt the moment he slipped away. There was no drama, no final struggle, just a quiet exhale and then stillness. She stayed there for a long time, holding him, unable to quite accept that he was gone. 43 years they had been together, and now she was alone. It felt impossible, unnatural, like someone had torn away half of herself. The funeral was held at the ranch, and people came from all over Montana to pay their respects. Harrison had been respected and loved by many, known as a man of integrity and kindness, someone who had proven that you could be both tough enough to survive frontier life and gentle enough to write poetry. They buried him on a hill overlooking the valley he had loved, with a simple stone that read, Harrison Everett, 1855–1924, cowboy, poet, beloved husband and father. In the weeks that followed, Natalie struggled. The house felt empty without Harrison's presence, the evenings unbearable without their reading ritual. She went through the motions of living, but there was no joy in it. Her children were worried about her, seeing how she was diminishing, how the light seemed to have gone out of her eyes. It was Hope who finally broke through to her. "Mama," she said one evening, finding Natalie sitting alone in the library staring at nothing. "You promised him you would keep living. You promised." "I know," Natalie said dully, "but I do not know how." Hope sat down beside her mother and took her hands. "The same way you taught us to live, by finding meaning and beauty in the world, by connecting with people, by reading and learning and growing, Papa would not want you to give up. He was my whole world," Natalie whispered. "No," Hope said firmly. "He was a huge part of your world, but not all of it. You still have us. You still have your grandchildren. You still have your books and your mind and so much to offer. Please, Mama, come back to us." It took time, but gradually Natalie began to rejoin the world. She threw herself into the lending library, expanding it and organizing it more systematically. She started a book club in Helena that met monthly to discuss literature. She spent time with her grandchildren, reading to them as she had read to their parents, passing on the love of learning to yet another generation. She lived for another 12 years after Harrison's death, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1936 at the age of 75. In those years, she wrote her own memoir, documenting the journey from that afternoon under the cottonwood tree to building a life and legacy in Montana. She wrote honestly about the challenges and joys, about love and loss, about the importance of staying true to yourself even in difficult circumstances. The memoir was published shortly before her death and became a regional bestseller, inspiring other women who were trying to navigate life on the frontier. Natalie's story showed that it was possible to be both practical and intellectual, to embrace hard work without giving up the things that fed the soul. When she died, they buried her beside Harrison on the hill overlooking the valley. Her stone read simply, Natalie Armstrong Everett, 1859–1936. Reader, teacher, beloved wife and mother. The ranch continued under Henry's management and eventually passed to his children. The library remained, expanded over the years but always keeping its original collection, including Harrison's journals and poetry, as a tribute to the couple who had built everything. The valley became known as Everett Valley, and the house, which had grown from that small foundation beside the stream into a sprawling ranch house, was designated a historical landmark. Generations of Everetts grew up in that house, learning to read in the library their great-great-grandparents had built, hearing the story of the literate cowboy and the woman reading under a tree who had found each other against all odds. The story became family legend, a reminder that love could transcend circumstances, that two people committed to shared values could build something lasting and meaningful. The cottonwood tree in Helena, where Harrison first approached Natalie, still stands, though it is ancient now. A plaque marks it as a historical site, telling the story of the meeting that led to one of Montana's most enduring love stories. Young couples sometimes visit it, hoping that some of Harrison and Natalie's luck might rub off on them, that they too might find someone who understands them completely. The volumes of Harrison's poetry remained in print, read by people all over the country who were moved by his simple but heartfelt verses about love and landscape, about finding beauty in unexpected places. Natalie's memoir went through multiple editions, taught in schools as an example of frontier life and women's history. But beyond the tangible legacy, beyond the books and the ranch and the family that continues to this day, Harrison and Natalie left something more important: proof that it is possible to live with integrity and passion, to honor both practical necessities and spiritual needs, to build a life that matters in ways both large and small. Their story reminds us that love is not just about grand gestures or dramatic declarations, though it can include those things. It is about showing up day after day, about sharing the mundane and the magnificent, about finding someone who sees you clearly and loves you anyway. It is about building something together that is greater than either person could have created alone. It reminds us that education and culture are not luxuries reserved for cities and privilege, but basic human needs that can be pursued anywhere, by anyone with determination and imagination. That a cowboy can be a poet, that a woman can be both strong and intellectual, that a ranch house can hold a library full of treasures. Most of all, it reminds us that one moment can change everything. That sitting down beside a stranger and having the courage to speak, to share who you really are, can lead to a lifetime of happiness. That love, when it is real and true, can overcome obstacles and endure through decades, growing deeper and richer with time. Harrison and Natalie Everett proved that the marriage of true minds admits no impediments, that love really is an ever-fixed mark that does not alter when it alteration finds. They showed that two people who value the same things, who respect and cherish each other, who commit to building something together, can create a legacy that extends far beyond their own lives. And it all started on a summer afternoon in 1881, when a literate cowboy saw a woman reading under a cottonwood tree and decided to take a chance. He sat down beside her and read her his heart, and she heard him, truly heard him, in a way no one ever had before. And from that simple beginning grew a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of connection, of shared values, of two souls recognizing each other across all the noise and chaos of the world. Their story lives on in the valley they loved, in the family they created, in the books they treasured, and in the hearts of everyone who believes that love and literature, beauty and hard work, poetry and practicality can all exist together in a life well lived.